Y'all remember that dress that was either blue and black or white and gold? You remember that? And it was the same picture, but different people had completely different perceptions of that same picture. And I think that that's really the same thing that's happening here with this Gillette ad. It's the same video, but people are having vastly different experiences of that video. And what I want to do here is actually try to explain each of those perceptions to the others, because I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding there. And I want to do that in a way that acknowledges each other's common humanity. And this last part's really important because one of the things that I see in a lot of these sort of social discussions or arguments, you might even say, is there's a lot of dehumanization of the opposing side, right? When people see one side as, sort of liberal sissy men and feminazis, and then the other side can dehumanize the other side as sort of bigots and assholes and abusers. But I don't think it's quite that simple. Indeed, I think that there's two perfectly valid or perfectly understandable perceptions of this film, and that I think that actually in being able to understand both sides is going to help us a lot in finding some common ground here. All right, so like I said, it's a little bit more complex than I thought. I've got some notes here. You might see me referring to them. First, I'm going to explain the side of people who did like the video, who thought that it was a good ad, to the people who didn't like it. Okay. This one I think is a little bit easier, but here we go. All right, so guys, I want you to close your eyes and imagine that you're walking with your woman. Okay, so maybe, I don't know, maybe you're married, maybe you got a girlfriend, or maybe you don't have a girlfriend right now, but maybe you had a girlfriend. Imagine you're with a woman you're in love with, you care dearly about, and you're walking down the street and she's looking amazing, right? She's got, she's dressed just exquisitely. You're feeling proud to be walking with such a beautiful, wonderful woman. And you're walking down the street, you walk by, it's a busy street and, or somewhat busy, maybe downtown, and some guy comes up and he smacks your woman's ass. Just take for a moment to think how you would feel. What would be the emotions coming up in you in that time? I would feel a lot of anger. And I would surely confront that guy. And there's a lot of guys who wouldn't think twice about taking a swing, as that's a very disrespectful, violent action, right? So, and okay, well, maybe it's a little bit less than that. Maybe he's just, maybe he doesn't smack her ass, but he says she's a nice ass. She has a nice ass, like right in front of him, she's calling that out. How would you feel if you're walking with your woman and some guy's like, hey, nice ass, probably still be pretty pissed. Might still confront him, or at least let your wife or your woman know that you're not okay with that. And while you might not want to have violence, that's not okay with you. So I think that most people who liked this ad just saw it as simply a denunciation of sexual harassment. Right, that's what we're talking about. In that case, that's a case of sexual harassment. And we just see it as simply denouncing sexual harassment and also violent bullying, right? Two things where I think we can all get on the same page that violent bullying is not a good thing, nor is sexual harassment. And, where the video goes to differ is just to point out that they're talking to men. Now, here's the thing, right? Of course, it often feels like they're shaming men. But I don't think it's actually an attempt to shame men, but simply call the fact that most sexual harassment and violent bullying is done by men, right? So men are the ones who have the power to change that. And so I saw that video, and I think that most people saw this video as a call to men, as the people who have the power to change this, and saying, hey, help us, change that, right? So let's not have that guy harassing your woman as you're walking down the street, or when you're not there. Even worse is like when she's on her own and you can't be there to protect her, right? I think that's pretty understandable. So okay, so now let's look at the other side. All right, so guys, you might be done now. You understand that side, but maybe you can use this to help explain to people why you didn't like this video. Okay. So this is explaining, why guys didn't like this video, and it's explaining it to people who did like this video. So first off, I think it's important to make a point that if it was experienced as an attack on men, as men being shamed. All right, and I think the context, the current context, is really important when we talk about. I mean, if you think about when was the last time in the past year or so that you heard someone talk about men or masculinity in a way that was positive, right? There's a lot of talk about toxic masculinity, men abusers, and just any time we talk about the male gender, for the most part, it's been very critical. So there's a lot of guys who are rightly feeling a little bit under attack. They're like, God, what is wrong with me? What is wrong with my gender expression? So that's part of where we are, right? And I think that what we're in is sort of this struggle for what is the gender expression? What does it mean to be a man? What does that look like? And it's important to point out that over the last 40 or so years, there has been this feminist revolution, and there's been thousands of hours of exploration and discussion and celebration of what it means to be a woman. And brilliant minds, brilliant women, and all people have thought about this, expression, and also, looking into non-binary and different expressions of gender. But for men, there hasn't been a corresponding shift. And so there's a little bit of this sort of a vacuum of cultural change. But of course, there has been slow progression, right? The masculinity of today is not the same as the masculinity of my grandpa. And it's just that change has been less intentional, right? So for example, like Susan Faludi, a feminist and author, points out that sort of men used to define themselves more on how they were perceived in society, what was the role that they took in society, what was their profession, how were they helping people. And over the past 50 or so years, it's shifted a lot more to sort of image. How are they perceived in society? So it's less about what they do, and it's more about perception. And so there's been a lot of changes in how masculinity is measured, or manhood is measured. And one example of that is that being muscular, being physically muscular, is a lot more important today than it was during my grandpa's when he was middle age. And so you see a lot more guys spending time in the gym and emphasizing having big muscles, or almost like toughness, even though actually the threat of violence, I think, is probably less today than it was for my grandpa. However many years ago that was, 60, 70, 80, when he was 35. Anyway, so the culture of masculinity has been changing, and it's been changing in a less intentional way. And in this vacuum of identity, there's a lot of different things that are sort of sprouting up there. Guys are trying to find ways to have this image of masculinity and toughness. And of course, toughness and strength tends to be something that people latch onto as masculinity. And also, of course, having some amount of sexual bravado. Now, it's important to understand that at the same time that this culture exists, you have men that are growing up. They're going from childhood into teenage years. They're undergoing their psychological development and their process of individuation in this cultural context, right? So for most men, most men faced violence and ridicule if they did not at least tacitly accept or actively engage in sexual bravado and physical violence. It's just a simple fact. Guys get beat up if they're not willing to fight, right? That's the world that we live in. During this time is when we're forming our identity of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a person. And so what happens there is that the individuation process takes in that cultural context. And so most men have tied with their identity of who I am is associated with the culture that they were brought up in, right? So what we're seeing here is that who I am is tied to some amount of acceptance of violence and a certain amount of sexual bravado. So when we have a critique of a lot of those behaviors at the same time, what gets stirred up is just this sense of shaming of who they are, of personal identity. And regardless of the logic, of whether or not it's logical or if it makes sense, the fact is that a lot of men experienced this ad as an attack on their identity, an attack on manhood. And if you probably hooked them up to, sensors, you would see that the physiological response was one of being attacked. And so it's pretty understandable that their reaction was negative. And then, of course, the physiological response tends to come first, and then after that is the logical justification of that. And I haven't seen really many great arguments other than just they feel like they're being shamed. Actually, and this seems to be the most common of the men that I've talked to, is they feel like that they're shaming manhood. Now, this I think is a great data point to look at, because it's really hard to shame someone if they do not already feel some degree of shame. Let that sink in for a moment. Men feel like they're being shamed, and that shows that they're already feeling some degree of shame for their manhood, for masculinity. All right? So, of course, this is a very vulnerable point, and they're going to protect those. People tend to protect the most vulnerable parts most voraciously. So it's understandable that they're more likely to make comments on this because they're more angry, and because it hits at that core vulnerability. People are going to tend to lash out more when they feel really vulnerable. The good news is that this is an important process, right? Just with any social change movement, there tends to be first it's dismissed, then it's ridiculed, then it's fought against, and then it's accepted. That's just sort of the general process. And we're already in that third step of the 4-step process, right? And it wasn't just a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, Axe had a commercial about that was very similar to this ad that demonstrated different expressions of masculinity, of manhood, and there was not the backlash. So what do we do from here, right? I mean, I think that an important thing that I see here is that there's always room to keep another person's humanity intact, even while we disagree with them. And it can be really valuable to acknowledge that we each have very understandable experiences of that same product, and we don't need to dehumanize each other, call each other names, or anything like that. And so, what can we do in the next time that something like this happens? Is I think we can, take a moment to seek some understanding of the other party rather than just reacting. And also kind of letting go of this concept of being right or wrong, because that's actually not very useful in this type of discussion. But what's more useful is just looking to understand the other party, and there we can often see that there's two very valid perceptions. So I hope this is useful to you, and I'll talk to you later. Cheers.